Her voice was sweet and liquid, like a stream that lulls all other streams to sleep and dream. Her eyes like doe's eyes, whose dark gaze would make a lion lie down dazed and half awake. She seemed an alphabet of loveliness. Curved letters were the curling of each tress. Straight letters were her stature, and her lips were like a letter formed as an ellipse, and all the letters made her like that bowl that shows the world as an enchanted whole.
Ho-ri-o, ho, ho-ri-o, ho, ho-ri-o, ho, ho.
Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And this time we read the 12th-century poem Layli and Majnun by Nezami Ganjavi.
Did you like it? I had read parts of it before. I'd never read it all the way straight through before, but I'd read parts of it. Had you read it before?
I had never read it before. I'd heard of it a little bit. It gets mentioned a lot as like a classic love story. And I guess that's why people read it, because it's, these two spectacular lovers that were written about so beautifully and told many, many times by many, many different people over the course of, the Middle Ages and even still today. I did enjoy it quite a lot. I particularly enjoyed this translation that we were reading, which is by Dick Davis. It just came out by Penguin Classics, and it's a delightful little translation.
I was really happy that that came out because years ago I remember being interested in teaching Layli and Majnun in class, and I could never find a translation I was happy with, but I knew some of Dick Davis's other translations, which I think are excellent. We'd read his translation of Attar's Conference of the Birds in the past, and so I was really excited to see he's done this work now.
Yeah, I don't know what the structure of the original poem was. I didn't have a chance to look that up, but this is, translated into iambic pentameter rhymed couplets and occasional and very interesting use of internal rhymes, like in the bit that you read for the opening there, where it takes on almost a Lin-Manuel Miranda feel, if I can say that. Not quite like that, but like a little bit. I don't know. It had some fun rhythm to it at times, which I quite enjoyed.
Yeah, I really appreciate that he does that because the rhyme couplet structure, I understand why to choose that because it is a good imitation of the original Persian line structure, but it can feel kind of sing-songy in English. And so those internal rhymes break it up and give you a different kind of rhythm that feels natural.
Yeah, exactly. How did you first hear about this work?
Well, it's kind of interesting. I had first heard of it when I was reading around in medieval Persian court poetry, just kind of familiarizing myself with that. But then, if I remember correctly, in the late 90s, Maria Rosa Menocal came out with a book called Shards of Love, which was about the origins of the lyric in medieval literature. And so she talks about a whole range of poetic production, both in Europe and in Persian and Arabic literature. But she puts it in the context of a much longer history. And one of the things she talks about is Eric Clapton's Layla. And she kind of puts it together with Nezami's poem. And for me, it was really exciting. It was the first time I'd read a piece of scholarship that was dealing in a very serious way with medieval texts, but it was imaginatively extending far beyond that scope to put it into a much bigger picture. And so for me, that was really exciting. And so my sense of the poem is always tangled up with a sense of that long history.
I admit that I'd first heard of the poem because that's one thing people say about that song, is that it is inspired by this poem. But I like the book better.
That's fair. Yeah, and it is super interesting because it's very layered. Like on the one hand, yeah, it's about love, and we will talk about whatever it is that's meant by that. But it's also about a lot of other kinds of things as well. And one of the things it's about, and I'm sure we'll talk about this at length, is disordered states of mind.
Yes.
I was really struck by that aspect of it on this reading.
As was I. Nothing had prepared me for that. I mean, I guess I knew that it was somebody who was, burning, so to speak, with an intense love for somebody, and that they weren't able to consummate that love, and therefore frustration. I guess a lot of medieval romances follow that plot line. But this really felt like it was dealing a lot with the nature of that kind of mental illness, let us say, and how it both affected the lives of the characters who were suffering from it, and how it affected how they thought of themselves, how society dealt with them, and the ramifications of it, and, how useless it was when people would come up and try to give them advice to just, get over it. You just pay attention to better things.
And even loving family members, right? You can see when his father visits him, or his mother, or his uncle, or friends, they're doing their best, right? In some cases, at least, right? But he's not really reachable, and seeing him deteriorate and the physical manifestations of that deterioration are really unsettling.
So a lot to talk about with this one. But first, we should talk a little bit about the author of this version of the Layla and Majnun story.
Yeah, let me say a little bit about that. The story, as we've mentioned already, appears in a number of different versions in the Middle Ages and emerges originally from an Arabic source, probably an oral narrative that then takes different written forms, right? And so the one by Nezami that we've been talking about is particularly lovely and also, I think, particularly influential in terms of its afterlife. So Nezami Ganjavi lived in the late 12th century, dies in 1209, and he was a Sunni Muslim person of Persian and Kurdish background who lived in a city called Ganje, which is now in Azerbaijan, but would have been, Persia. Yeah. And he wrote a whole bunch of things, but he's best known for the set of 5 long narrative poems he wrote called the Khamsa, which just means like 5 of them. And the first one's a kind of treasury of secrets, sort of short narratives. But the other 4 are what we would call romances. And there are a few different romance stories. Layli and Majnun is the middle one. And the last of the 5 is an Alexander romance. And I'm really interested in depictions of Alexander the Great in medieval literature. So I actually had familiarized myself with Nizami's Alexander romance before, which is why I know a little bit about the Khamsa. And I think what's really interesting to think about that framework, because it lets you see Layli and Majnun, as Nezami tells the story, as part of a larger framework. Like it's that particular story, but for him, it's also part of a bigger picture around, what is love? What are these emotional affinities about? What is desire? It's a whole way of seeing the world, I think.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the love that forms the core of this story, and I'll go over basically what happens. Qais is the son of a king, and as a child, he falls in love with a schoolmate, Layli. But he seems a little too in love with her, and soon he's dubbed Majnun, which means the man who is mad. When Layli's family refuses to allow them to marry, Majnun begins to act more erratically, running away from home, hanging out in the wilderness, and all the time singing songs to Layli. For her part, Layli waits patiently, sending Majnun messages written in her blood. Majnun teams up with a local warrior to wage war on Layli's family. He wanders in the wilderness, freeing deer from hunters. He puts himself in servitude to a beggar woman. And eventually, Layli is married off to a rich man, Ibn Salam. But she refuses to consummate the marriage. Years pass, and Majnun remains lost in the wilderness, while Layli remains patient. In all their adult lives, they are only in the same space twice. Eventually, Majnun's father dies, his mother dies, Layli dies, and then Majnun dies upon Layli's grave.
It's a pretty dark story, but it has these like transcendently beautiful moments. And I think some of them happen near the beginning, but some of them happen close to the end. You didn't mention that one little kind of almost PS at the end. It's like, when you watch a movie and then there's the credits and then there's the little thing that tells you what happened to them. There's
Yes.
One of their associates, Zaid, has a vision of where they are ultimately, and then they appear sort of back together in this intimate setting, as intimate as their childhood schoolroom setting that they inhabited together. So it's a dark story that has a kind of dark trajectory, but it's also got this circularity to it. The children together in the classroom, and then the two of them together, seated on a single throne, enwrapped in one another.
Yeah, they get to spend eternity together in a perfect, holy, let's say, love, in the sense that it's not base. It is entirely of higher things. That part of the arc of their story is that their love seems a bit physical at first, but because they aren't able to consummate it, it quickly becomes this other thing where it's about the desire, and that guides them through a kind of transcendence into much higher forms of love.
Yeah, I think that I agree with you, but I think there's like a useful distinction to make between sexual and physical, because it's not a sexual union. Like that's clear that doesn't happen, but it's very physical in the sense that like they use up their bodies.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. Absolutely, right? You're absolutely right.
And it's kind of cool, right? Like not just Majnun's physical deterioration, but also like I think you mentioned Layli writing to him in her blood and stuff like that. Like maybe it's a metaphor, but maybe it isn't. Like there's this real physicality in how they connect.
And they also appreciate each other's bodies
Yeah.
in the way that they describe each other's beauty and so forth. It is very much in terms of metaphors about the body and about the sensual pleasures of the body, even if those sensual pleasures are never to be directly enjoyed the way that we might expect them to be, so to
Yeah,
speak.
it's like this endless state of deferral, kind of, right? Like it's
Yes.
just beyond the edge of what's possible.
And by the end, explicitly, if you defer long enough, you'll get to have the best version of this forever.
Yeah. And so one of, you were talking about this as being a kind of transcendence. And one of the things that the poem does is at certain moments, it really leans into that, like using kind of almost theological language and language that we could associate with Sufism. When we read Attar's Conference of the Birds, we talked about frameworks for thinking about human love in terms of a divine framework, right? And the kind of language that goes along with that. And some of that language shows up here. Like at one point early on, Majnun says, men say I'm drunk, or that love's made me an idolater. He says, Layli's the idol I bow down before. And that idea of the beloved as an idol is something we've seen. And also, he'll say at one point in his letter to her, my Kaaba is your lovely face. In other words, the point of orientation of prayer, right? The most sacred focus of devout attention. That's your face, he's saying, right? So that kind of language is something we've seen before. And the poem kind of leans into that a little bit more and more as it goes on. And that's I guess what we could call the sort of transcendence that gets promised.
That moment with the Kaaba was one of the most striking bits for me, I guess, early on in the book, at least, where his father takes him to Mecca, to the Kaaba, to this, the central item of veneration. I might be describing it poorly, but it's a big deal to make this visit, and it's a very holy thing.
It's a pilgrimage, right?
It's a pilgrimage, and you were supposed to circle around it. And what does he do? He runs up to the Kaaba and touches it and grabs onto it, which I always got the sense is not something you're really supposed to do in that moment. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that's a typical form of veneration there, but that's not my understanding.
Yeah. Well, his encounter there is really weird, right? Because his father's expecting him to ask to be cured from his disordered state of mind and to be restored to his old way of being and so on. And Qais, Majnun is not going to do this, right? He's going to throw himself even more deeply into the target of his devotion, right, which is Layli. And he says this interesting thing while he's there. He says, he describes himself while he's at the Kaaba as being like a knocker on a door, a ring that waits but can do nothing more. And in that metaphor, the door knocker, in some ways, that's kind of him talking about him being on that threshold of achieving his desires with Layli, right? Like it's that ring that's hanging on the door, but you never quite enter. But it's also a really vivid evocation of the way they depict the Kaaba in medieval manuscripts. And even in illustrations of Nezami's poem, in the Alexander section, they'll show a picture of the Kaaba and you see a door knocker on it, as part of the iconography of it. So it's this really weird moment where we're seeing him kind of, I don't know, he is totally oriented toward an object of devotion. He is totally oriented toward the thing that's going to lead him to transcendence, but it's not what everybody else thinks it is. And in that way, it's a lot like what happens in Attar's Conference of the Birds. The Shah Zaman story, remember when his disciples, his associates, try to direct him back toward Mecca. And he's like, no, I just really want to hook up with that Christian girl back in Constantinople. And they're like, no. This is a scenario that really is resonant with that. And those two works are very much part of the same, in some ways, part of the same milieu of thinking about how these Sufi forms of devotion give you a language to talk about how your love for another human being in this world can actually be part of a much bigger system. And the encounter at the Kaaba is absolutely a big part of this.
Well, it's him sort of ignoring all social convention and just saying, this is how I need to engage with this at this moment. And, he's full of a kind of righteousness that just ignores social convention. And this, occurs again and again.
Yeah. We mentioned a little bit earlier about how his state of mind goes. And, we were talking a few moments ago about love or love sickness or the disordered state of mind that comes from passionate love, right? And that's the kind of stereotype that gets associated with the Layli and Majnun story, right? That he's driven mad by love, right? And that is sort of what's going on, but the description of exactly what happens to him over time, as you were suggesting, is so richly articulated and very much in terms of what it does to the whole social fabric around him. So even from very early on, when he first starts becoming disordered, he's described as distracted. He weeps uncontrollably. He's described as having crazy woe. And people already very early on start talking about the social implications. So when Majnun and Layli would like to get married, Layli's father talks about the implications of taking a person who's insane into your family. He's totally opposed to it. And he's a bit of a villain here, but at the same time, he articulates something that he's probably not alone in feeling, right? He says this to Majnun's father. He says, I can't walk into flames that could well harm me. There's much to say against what you suggest. Your son's good-looking but unsuitable. His willfulness is indisputable. He's mad and shows it. It's ridiculous to think a madman's suitable for us. Pray that God cures him. Once his problem's over, will be the time to praise this faithful lover. Until your boy is competent and sane, don't bring this subject up to me again. Who'd buy a jewel that's flawed? And who would make a necklace with a thread that's sure to break?
Yeah.
Right. And so it's very kind of pragmatic. He's kind of a little bit of a villain here, but I'm sure he's not the first or the last to be ready to cut loose somebody who doesn't appear strong enough to bear the weight of this necklace that he's taking on.
In addition to the sort of physical effects that this is having on him and his actions, he's incredibly difficult to be with as a person or as a friend. Shortly after this rejection, he goes out into the wilderness and he meets Nofal, a local, I don't know if warlord's the right word, but a local guy who has had a lot of military success. And he meets Majnun and decides that this guy's got an interesting story, and they become fast friends. And it's like the first person in a long time who's been willing to take Majnun seriously and be friendly towards him. And Majnun seems to thrive under this. He seems to become much more healthy. He seems to become much more animated, much more focused. And Nofal decides he's going to do Majnun a favor and help him get, I guess is the word, Layli, by waging war on Layli's family, which is something he knows how to do. And he goes to wage war on them. And during the first battle, Majnun is not exactly on Nofal's side.
Yeah, he seems to not really understand the etiquette or protocol of war.
That's certainly one thing. Yeah, absolutely. He's rooting for both sides, right? And he's cursing out both sides at the same time. And he's upset at Layli's family, of course, because they are preventing him from being with Layli. But he's also upset with Nofal because they're waging war on Layli's family, which seems bad, but they're also waging war, period, which seems bad to him. He's very against that sort of thing. He's very peaceful in his way. This isn't the right solution, he seems to think. And Nofal and his troops are like, what is going on with this guy?
No, yeah, that whole scenario plays out in this really striking way because Nofal wages these two battles. Majnun behaves in the way you just described. And ultimately, the military battle is won. I mean, Nofal has Layli's father in a position where he has no options, really, right? But the father asks for Layli not to be given over. He says, and at first you think he's speaking from a position of care for his daughter. He says, God forbid I'd give my lovely child to this Majnun who's so deranged and wild. Madmen should be chained up, not handed over to a young girl to be her husband, lover. For me to grant his devilish desire would be like throwing brushwood on a fire. And he goes on to talk about Majnun. And then he says this. He says it'll be a source of bad repute for his family, he says. And so rather than let that happen, he says, I'll cut her head off, throw it in the street, and let it lie there for stray dogs to eat. And in this way, at least I'll be free from all this horror that's tormenting me. For dogs to eat her would be better than for her to marry that disgusting man. And there you see the, honor killing side of it, I guess. In other words, it's, that's what I mean by him being a bit of a villain. Part of it is him taking the position of caring for his daughter and not wanting to give her over to this madman, as he calls him. But part of it is this concern about what that does to the social fabric and what that does to social status. So there's a lot going on there, I think. There
is. It's a fascinating scene. And even more so, I when I was reading it, I took a note about this, and I was proven right that Layli's father will later say, I was just saying that.
Mm-hmm,
None of that was all rhetorical. And with my brilliant rhetoric of threatening to kill you first.
Yeah, thanks,
I
Dad.
was able to get Majnun off my case and save you, daughter, which is exactly what Layli wants, of course, as Layli is sitting pining for him. Yeah, it's really difficult. And again, during that second battle, after the first battle, when he was cursing him out and the battle is lost, then Majnun yells at Nofal, "This wasn't effective. What are you even doing? What kind of friend are you?" So they go into the second battle and he's much more willing to fight, but then that happens. And it's just like, Majnun, what are you doing? What are you doing? You're inconstant.
He's out of control, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's just how he is, I suppose. And so Nofal gets tired of it, and eventually he goes off again into the wilderness and has a much better job making a new set of friends.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's really, we talked a little bit about the way in which he kind of deteriorates, right? So he goes from that kind of state of being weeping and singing and stuff to a point where he tears his clothes and he's unsheltered, ragged and forlorn, ready to kill himself, right? So he's just deteriorating more and more. And there's this one passage that I was really moved by just shortly before he meets Nofal, where he's said to be experiencing not life so much as an extended dying. So he's like really abject. And at one point, Majnun says something really interesting about his state of being. And this is when he's talking to his father and he's describing the role of fate, like why things are the way they are. And he says this, he says, "I'm chained with iron chains, and what can aid me when I can only be what fate has made me? Love's bonds won't open of themselves. Love's weight can't be sloughed off once it's ordained by fate." And I think that's such an interesting passage because he's talking about love, right? But these chains that bind him, right? These are the chains that, a madman might wear, right? When we just saw Layli's father saying, a madman should be in chains. That's the appropriate thing for him, right? And he is kind of metaphorically chained, or I guess you could say chained with invisible chains by his state of mind. And this bondage kind of expresses itself in different ways as time goes by. And, he takes himself away from other people. He takes himself away from, Layli, away from everything, into the wilderness. And like you said, he gets new friends, and his new friends are animals. What do you make of that?
I was surprised. I found it very unexpected. And then, it seemed to make a bit of sense because, well, what's the logic of this? The logic is that he is not doing a good job, so to speak, integrating into human society. Therefore, he needs to be outside of human society and he can live amongst the animals. And part of why he's able to live amongst the animals is because through this process of loving from a distance, he is, again, getting a bit more holy and a bit more elevated. And therefore, he is a bit more pure in a sense.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, which is really counterintuitive, right? Because you might think, because at first he makes friends with a couple of deer, and then there's a raven he talks to, and then he gradually assembles this whole community of animals around him, right? And they protect him and kind of look after him and stand between him and others who might disturb him. It's like the whole thing happens. And you might think it's like, oh, because he's less civilized, he's more animal and less human. But that's not what's going on at all.
Yeah, he's the opposite of Enkidu.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's a very different kind of situation here, where rather than him being described as more animal, it's because he's, like you said, pure. He's kind of outside of things. There's one passage near the end that makes this explicit. It says, "This perfection of the love that he shared with Layli, that perfection was what rendered all Majnun's wild animals so tractable. There was no animal in him, no taint of what's unclean, no bestial constraint. And conquered by his uncorrupted soul, his animals acknowledged his control." Right? So it's like, I don't want to call it a mastery because he doesn't seem to have a master-servant relationship with them at all, but they are drawn to him in the same way that some of the other people who come to him, who are almost like fans in a way, right? Well, people will be drawn to him. The animals are drawn to him as well.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting. I don't totally understand it, but it's a really interesting set of relationships.
It is. One of the things that makes it particularly hard to understand, I suppose, is that it's not as if the animals are given personalities. They're not anthropomorphized at all, except that they do things you wouldn't expect animals to do. There are a few scenes, especially later on in this story, when he needs a bit of privacy when something is happening and the animals protect them. Like, you have to imagine him going to, Layli's grave and weeping at it, and the animals just surround it so no one can see what's happening.
Yeah.
And they're there for a long time. And it's like, what? What does this look like? How are we picturing this? It's an amazing image.
Well, it's very moving, right? It is an amazing image, and it's very moving too, because remember we mentioned at the very end of the work, after Layli and Majnun have both died, and Zayd has this vision of them, right? It's mentioned that enough time has passed that the animals have died off. Like, in other words, they've sort of generationally, like they stayed there to invigilate the grave, but gradually have disappeared over time. Right. And so it's this really neat sense of them almost as like, I don't know what to call them, like guardians almost of Majnun even after death. So it's a really interesting kind of layered set of relationships there.
His desire not to harm others, including the animals, goes as far as to not eat meat anymore, which seems like a logical endpoint for this. But not only does he not eat meat, he barely eats anything. He just takes as much of a vegetable as he needs once a month. I think he says at one point.
Yeah. Well, that's, on one hand, that's, we can associate that with kind of the classic symptomology of lovesickness, but it also, this time again, I was reading it and I was seeing it in terms of anorexia. I was seeing it in terms of disordered states of mind that affect what you can put in your body. And so I was not really prepared to kind of see that level of it.
Yeah. It's not like the book or the translation is pointing you towards that, especially it's not trying to underline that connection. But once you start reading this with a sympathetic mind towards its depiction of somebody as suffering.
I think it does come from the translation, but not from any mistranslation at all, but because, we were talking earlier about the way in which the internal structure of the lines makes it feel quite natural, even though you've got these rhymed couplets, compared to other translations I've read where the rhymed couplet, I don't know, felt to me kind of very artificial. Like it felt the sing-songiness that can easily happen in an English translation with those rhymed couplets kind of takes you away from connecting with the characters as human beings, right? And so here, I think because that translation does a really good job of not luring you into this sing-songy kind of frame of mind, I was feeling the human part of it, I guess, I don't know what to call it, the narrative of it more.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I was saying that it's not like they're underlining the word anorexia doesn't show up, right? It's nothing like that.
Not at all.
I suspect you're right. I mean, I haven't read other translations, but this is a very naturalistic thing. And so even though there are moments of high poetry and high metaphor and big, long descriptions and involved rhetoric, nevertheless, there's a naturalism to the basic tone of the poem, the basic tone of the narrator, that encourages you, or encouraged me anyways, to read this perhaps more sympathetically than I would have if it had been written in highfalutin, old-timey story language.
Yeah, I've got a really good example of this when he's talking to his mother, who's come to, try to talk him down. And again, he's talking about his state of mind being fated. It's that same thing that I was talking about a little bit earlier, how he describes fate as determining how things are. And he says this, he says, I'm innocent, I'm not to blame. All that's occurred is not because of me. All this was fated from eternity. My sorrow isn't something you'll assuage by trapping me within a second cage. Don't ask me to come home, to weep and sigh there. I fear I'll be so desperate that I'll die there. I dread the thought of home, where I would soon be dead. If I come home, all I'll do is grieve distractedly and look for ways to leave. He says, Mother, go back and leave me to my wilderness of pain. Right? And so it's like, you really hear it, as deeply felt, right? And not just artistic language.
Exactly. It's not presenting these characters as archetypes. It's presenting them as people.
That's right.
Which I guess I hadn't thought of it that way because I don't know. Again, I don't know sort of other translations of it and whatnot, but I'm familiar with translations that would attempt to make them much more archetypal. And it's true that I would just read that and think, yeah, no, lovesick. Don't need to think about it. Don't need to sympathize with it. It's not going to hit me. And that might be my fault as a reader who just can't latch into a more, I don't know, melodramatic form of translation or something, like a more high, not highbrow, but kind of a highbrow, lowbrow mixture of that sort of 19th century ecstatic translation.
Yeah.
That's probably not the way to put it, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, I think that is part of it. But I think the other part of it is, what we've alluded to just a little bit, like the fan culture that emerges around the Layli and Majnun story and is already happening within this narrative itself, within Nizami's version itself. Like, in other words, how the story of two people's incredible suffering and all the suffering that falls upon those who love them, right? So all of that, how that gets transmuted into something that's transcendent and beautiful and repeatable and to be emulated and to be, to engender lots of poems and lots of songs and art and all kinds of stuff, right? It gets aestheticized. I don't know if that's the right word for it, but it becomes archetypal, right? It becomes this beautiful thing that you run variations on.
Very early in their story, everybody seems to know about them.
Yeah.
And while the people who are sort of directly around them, their families, the people in their society, cannot stand them for being such difficult people to be with. Everybody who doesn't have to live with them thinks they're amazing.
That's it. They have this huge fan base from the get-go.
Yeah, exactly. They think that the poems are great. The songs that they're making are great. They think the love story is beautiful. And it's very much this fanish sense of distance. Like, I love that work, but the difficult person who made it, I don't want to have to actually engage with. And a few of the fans who spread the words about these songs and repeat them and recite them and make pilgrimages to see them or to be near them actually do end up becoming characters in the story. And they have a difficult time sometimes transitioning from fan to person who actually knows these difficult people.
Yeah, it's really complex. Like the go-between role and the fan role, like these two are juxtaposed side by side. Because like you said, it starts really early on. Like already when Majnun's first heading out into the wilderness, he's running around crying his lament of Layli, Layli, bareheaded with torn clothes. He became an object of contempt, a source of shame. He could see no distinction between bad and good. And singing songs as lovely as the light cast by the evening star in Yemen's night. And every line he sang was learned by heart by someone ravished by its artless art. Men followed in his footsteps, wondering at his despair, and wept to hear them sing. Right? So like immediately that suffering is transmuted into, wow.
Yeah.
Right? Which is kind of awesome and creepy at the same time, I have to say.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, from a modern perspective, it's playing into the great suffering brings great art trope, which is not an especially true trope, though, sometimes things happen, but it's absolutely buying into that hook, line, and sinker. Like you see that going on here. Everybody's like, wow, these people are so desperately unhappy. I have to find out more. Like I want to hear these horrible stories and these beautiful but tragic songs.
It's exactly right.
Suffer more for me.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And it's like really disorienting. And this thing just continues to go on. So Layli and Majnun are exchanging poems between them. And then many lovely songs, it says, were based upon the lover's story and the songs they'd sung. And harps and lutes and flutes, whatever tune they played, it spoke of Layli and Majnun. Their family's children heard these compositions so often that they all became musicians, right? And so even the kids in the family are like, wow, let me play Layli and Majnun, right? And so it's like, it's almost infectious kind of. And they start getting fans coming to Majnun to visit.
And they often don't stick around for too long.
No.
Because they've heard so much about his lifestyle. And it sounds amazing on paper, but they want to eat.
Exactly. It's super interesting. So one guy who comes is a guy called Salam Baghdadi. So Salam is his name. He's from Baghdad. And he, of course, is one of the ones who's heard about the incredible fame of these songs. And he's heard about it all the way over in Baghdad, right? Everybody sings these songs. And so everybody wants to know, where's this stuff coming from? And so that's how Salam comes to Majnun. And he says to him something which at first makes it seem like he wants to be his disciple. He wants to really jump in with both feet and become part of this community of lovers. He says, "You are my Qibla, so allow me to bow down before you and to worship you." So it's a same kind of devotional language we saw earlier on associated with Layli, right, in Majnun's mind, right? But pretty soon, like you said, I mean, it turns out for him, it's mainly about the poems and not so much about the devotion. And he wants to eat, and he ends up taking the poems back home with him. He goes back to Baghdad, and he brings all of the perfect poems he'd been taught, and everywhere he sang them, men would stare to hear such loveliness and such despair. So he's like the agent.
Well, I suppose so. But I'm also thinking about in terms of, Is the problem with Salam Baghdadi, this is not something that's really addressed by the poem, but it's something we can think about, is his problem that he's trying to, so to speak, consummate the relationship that he feels towards his beloved, the composer, right?
Yeah.
He's got this non-reciprocal lover-beloved relationship with the author and subject of these beautiful, tragic poems. And he thinks he wants that to become, oh, we are in the same space. We have a relationship in real life. This is even closer. It is together. But actually, if you're going to learn anything from Majnun's story, it's that isn't necessarily the optimal solution to your love.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, people have different desires for different things, and it's all fit into this one single system. And I think one of the things that's going on with Salam Baghdadi is that, like, in the same way that Nofal thought that, I can use my skills, my military skills to solve this problem for Majnun, so too Salam Baghdadi kind of is focused on, like you said, the proximate stuff. For him, it's the poetry. But it's also like, I don't know how to put this really well. He loves the poetry, in the same way that Majnun loves Layli's body, but he doesn't just love Layli's body, right? Layli's body is a kind of vehicle, like her body and her soul and all of that is something that his desire is going to kind of just sort of pull him upward into this transcendent state. And Salam Baghdadi loves the poetry, but I don't know that, how can I put it? It's like Layli's body. Do you know what I mean? It's like, I don't know that it's transcendent for him. Like he's fixed on the letter, kind of the letters, as opposed to the thing that's beyond them, maybe. Right. That's the sense I get of it. Like, and that's why, like, he takes this stuff home with him, almost like, I mean, he is a real devotee, like he's a sincere fan, but it's almost like booty, right? So he comes back for a second visit later on, stays for a month or two, writing down any poem that was new, ghazals and couplets, fragments he would jot on scraps of paper and preserve the lot. And when he'd gathered all that could be had, he took them as a wonder to Baghdad. So it's like, I don't want to say extractive exactly, but do you know what I mean? Like he's there for the poetry.
Yeah.
That's what he's there for.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting because it's like kind of material. Like, I don't mean it in a negative way, but it's like he loves the body rather than the spirit. Like he loves the beautiful outside, not the thing that it's transcendently concealing, I think.
Right. And his role in this is going to be to promulgate the story.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is an important role, I think, in this. I mean, the author is obviously drawing on a tradition of this kind of text, and he will often shout out the people who wrote down this section or transmitted this part of the poem with a lot of praise. Like, thank goodness we have these people so that we can now all learn from this.
Yeah, and he says actually really explicitly at one point when he's talking about Zayd, who's another character who's kind of got a fanish relationship, but also becomes a go-between, a sort of someone who's suffered in love in a way that's a little bit like Majnun. He has an unfulfillable love for his cousin. And so Layli befriends him and he becomes a go-between for them. But he also is someone who's gathering up the scraps, right? The literary scraps. And this is really important, Nezami says, because he through gathering all that, he became the cause of their renown. It was through him this lover's tale became so loved and widespread and achieved such fame. So this is clearly a good thing, right? This idea that that's how the story got out there into the world, is through these people who were touched by it.
Zayd also has a difficult time of it. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's one point where Majnun is just going on, and Zayd finally snaps and is like, you're filled with so much self-contempt and you're so infatuated. Can you for a moment just stop? And Majnun, with all the rhetorical force and artistry that he's got, just lays into this guy, his friend allegedly, and snaps at him. My nature is to be sensitive and kind. If you can't see this, you've a wicked mind. Which is like, did you see what you just did there, Majnun?
Yeah. He doesn't sound like an easy person to be with.
No, and even when he meets up with Layli, the poems that he sings to her, while sometimes having moments of "you are so wonderful," are often blaming her or accusing her of being unfaithful because she's forced into marrying someone else who she does not consummate the relationship with, like understands that she needs to honor marriage vows in a sense, but that she's not going to ruin her relationship with Majnun. She's not going to spoil that. She's going to fulfill the letter of the marriage law, but preserve herself in other ways for him. But Nevertheless, he's still constantly accusing her of cheating on him, of being untrue to him, even though she's been incredibly true to him.
What do you think about her as a character? Like, we were talking a lot about Majnun, and he does suck up a lot of the oxygen.
Yes, he
But what do you
does.
think about her? Right? But what do you think about her? I found her also very interesting.
She's interesting. There's not a lot about her in many ways. Like, we get a few sections on her and from her perspective, or focus specifically on her. That she is also a writer, that she also writes songs and poems is, of course, very good. And she has a very different approach to it because she is integrating into her role in society, but that role is incredibly limited because she is a woman in this society. And she even gets a chapter where she gets to talk about that, which I found really interesting. She says, "Oh, I was Layli once, but now you'll see how much more mad than my Majnun I'll be. He's a black star, a besotted child, but I'm 1,000 times more crazed and wild. And though pain seeks him out, I'm still the one who has to suffer more than he has done. I am a woman. As a lover, he can be as reckless as he wants to be, go where he wants. A man need never know the wasting agonies I undergo."
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And she's got a point, but we don't get to hear as much about her wasting as we get to hear about his.
Well, I think you're absolutely right in saying that that's partly the social conventions, right? That's I guess you would say that the trap that she's in, right? That she's restricted in what she can do and express openly, but she does a lot, right, within those constraints. But also there's this sense that there's almost like, I don't want to call it a hierarchy exactly, but a nested quality in terms of how we're able to perceive their love. So on the one hand, they're like a pair, right, and equal in the balance in some way in that pair. And sometimes we get this very dualistic language that really lets us see them as two halves of a single whole. But there's also this language that gets used to describe them that kind of puts Majnun as the outer covering almost, and her as being the thing that's hidden within. Like one example for that kind of language is, at one point there's a slip of paper that has Layli and Majnun's names on it, the two names. And I'm trying to remember exactly what happens. It gets torn in half, and one of them is, I guess, destroyed or something, like the one that has Layli's name on it, and the one that's Majnun's name persists. And whoever it is he's with is really befuddled by this and confused by it. And Majnun says, no, that's appropriate because she's the one that's the more hidden and more sacred and less visible and less exposed to the world. And he's the one that's left exposed to the world. So I wonder if it's part of that kind of dualism that doesn't just put things side by side, the two things, but nests them inside one another. I wonder if that's part of what's going on too.
Yes. Before we get to that, I do want to say that the moments with Layli where she, is forced into marriage and her husband comes and is like, all right, it's time to consummate the marriage. And she's just like, no.
She's like, nope.
Let me explain how very no this is. That was a fantastic scene. I really enjoyed that scene quite a lot. And he takes the hint. Like, he is frustrated and upset about it. But after his first attempts to make something happen, whether she wants it or not, he understands, no, this is not on. So that was nice.
Yeah. I mean, all the way through, there's all these interesting ways in which we kind of see her as, she's within the gendered structures of the 12th century, right? But she also kind of pushes at the edge of them. And that happens already at the beginning when, there's girls in the schoolroom. That's how Layli and Majnun meet, right? That there's male and female children in the schoolroom. And that's actually a very often depicted in medieval manuscripts of the poem, right? They love to show that schoolroom scene. So that's kind of interesting, right? And then she, as you said, she's also a writer. She also writes these songs and these poems. And she's the one who takes the initiative in exchanging letters with Majnun and gets Zayd to be the go-between. So she's kind of like surprisingly assertive in certain cases, given the constraints she inhabits.
And I also wonder, I have a harder time tracing this because I'm not as familiar with the specifics of the culture that this emerged from, but it felt at times like Majnun is also pushing against the edges of his gender, so to speak, especially during the battle scene when he spends the whole time just weeping and cursing everybody out and is absolutely not playing the role that he is supposed to play in this moment. He does it in the second battle, but in the first battle, he is nowhere near where he's supposed to be. And that felt like a failure to be a man.
That's an interesting point. And, when he starts making friends with the animals, that starts when he dissuades this one hunter from killing a deer that he's been hunting for some time. Like he has to feed his family, right? But Majnun gives him his horse, and that's how he, gets the deer. And then there's another deer, and so on. And it's like it's not exactly feminine, but he's not being very manly. You know what I mean? He's not doing stereotypically manly things. So that's quite interesting to think about whether the two of them are kind of violating these conventions, and that's one of the reasons why society has a hard time accommodating them.
Yeah, I mean, I at least know from medieval Europe that saintly figures often don't fulfill these roles that they're expected to fulfill, and that's a sign of holiness rather than anything else. But it's still interesting to see that brought up and praised, or at least put in a character that you're supposed to feel somewhat sympathetic towards.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right.
Well, you brought up that piece of paper with both of their names on it and a scene which talks about how the two characters' personalities are intertwined. And we get a lot of chapters where there's this interesting formal structure where the lines switch between Layla is this, Majnun is that. This happens a few times, and it's a nice sort of thing that we turn to. These sections actually are quite long, or longer than I would have expected them to be. But it is a nice break from the other types of writing that we get.
Yeah, it's quite lovely. Let me read just a couple of lines. It goes back and forth. Layli was this, Majnun was that. Layli, a field that was still freshly growing. Majnun, a field when autumn's winds are blowing. Layli, who with the dawn was glad to rise. Majnun, a lamp whose flame at sunrise dies. Layli, whose teasing curls fell like a wave. Majnun, whose earring marked him as a slave. Layli, who drank her draught of wine at dawn. Majnun, who sang sad songs, whose clothes were torn. Layli sewed silk within, Majnun burned rue against the harm that the evil eye might do. Layli was like a rose, while Majnun's eyes shed rose water. The tears a rose supplies. I mean, it's a whole lot of it, and it's kind of hypnotic, right? And in some ways, it's like a parallelism, like, absolutely parallel, but sometimes they're weirdly complementary or even contradictory. So it's like there's a lot of complexity in that pairing, I think.
Well, and this goes up a notch later on when Majnun is writing one of his whiny little letters to Layli and uses this similar format, but now it's I and you, of course. So you are the locked forbidden treasury. I've still to forge the iron that makes its key. I am the dust beneath your feet, but you, who is it whom you give life's water to? I bow before you clutching at your dress. Who is it whom your lovely hands caress? Like, It goes on. It really goes on. But it's interesting how that is happening. And then as we reach the end of the text, they are more and more conjoined, leading to a long list at the end of two become one kind of imagery where they are two things, they are two semicircles that defined a single circle. Things like that emerge in this really fantastic section towards the end of the book that I don't know. I imagine you loved it because I know you also love this kind of list. I love this kind of list. It really reminded me of another notorious list maker, the 20th century French author Raymond Roussel, who just wrote endlessly long lists very much like this. If he wanted to get across the idea that there are two things that are now one, his list would have been 4 times as long as this very long list in this book is.
Oh, it is pretty awesome. I just want to read a couple lines of it because it's so cool. They were two semicircles that defined a single circle when they were aligned. Birds have 2 wings and scales 2 pans. There's no perplexing mystery that this is so. 2 candles melt into a single bowl and so become one body and one soul. One source can fill 2 flasks. 2 strands are spun. Then in a rope they're twisted into one. It goes on to describe these 2 selfless souls. Now they were one. That like a falcon flew, a single entity that had been 2, right? 2 wings and the one bird, right? So it's like it collapses into this very, very, very abstract kind of dualism by the time you get to the end of the poem, right? And that's where the transcendence is. And the list is just icing on the cake.
And I guess that's where we end with our couple, with the vision after they've died that Zaid has of seeing them together embracing in a physical way, like giving each other gentle kisses, as I recall. But they were still just sort of sitting on what effectively sounded like a park bench in a nice garden, sitting and sort of nuzzling heads together.
Yeah. At times they drink their wine in little sips. At times they gently kiss each other's lips. At times they talk of all they'd been denied. At times they lean together side by side. I mean, it's very park benchy.
It's so park benchy, and that's nice for them. I'm glad. Yeah. That seems like where they wanted to be.
Yeah.
I'm happy for them. But I'm
so happy for them.
I don't know. A few scenes earlier, after Layli's husband dies, and after 2 years of appropriate mourning and keeping herself entirely secluded from the public, they are finally able to have their big meeting. And it was like, okay, all the barriers are down. All the family who cared about anything is dead. We could actually do this now.
Mm-hmm.
And
He's just a mess.
he is such a mess. And I felt like the text didn't even give me a good reason why he flips out suddenly. He seems to switch on a dime and be like, no, this can't happen. I have got to go. And runs back into the wilderness, just leaving her shattered.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I found that scene, I mean, it was very Majnun, but it was incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, that's just where he's at, though. I mean, he's like, it's the mental illness thing, right? Like, we were talking about this, right? Like, if it was love sickness, you'd have a happy, like, everything would sort itself out, right? But it's not just love, it's something totally uncontrollable.
Yeah.
Right? And, he talks about it in terms of fate when people try to help him out of where he's at, right? It's not fixable in this world.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess good for the text for not presenting him as being magically cured of mental illness, because now he can get the girl.
Yeah.
But it is an interestingly frustrating moment in the narrative, and this eternal park bench ending, for me, who's not invested in the religious aspect of this, it's not as satisfying.
Well, sort of like what happens is like, it's not exactly that it's not just simply that he goes away. What happens is like, you think they're going to meet up together here under the palm trees, right? But what happens is he's able to utter his song from a little distance, right? So she's terribly unhappy that he is not able for them to be together, like together in one space. But he's able to perform this music, right? This song. And she hears it from a little distance, right? So it's like, how can I put it? It's not that they're together because they're not in the same space completely, but he's in her presence, right? So they're like, it's almost like being on a threshold or something like that, like where you're not quite in there, but you're not quite outside there.
Yeah.
And so it's like almost like that. And it's I think significantly, it's in that song that he sings in her presence that 2-in-1 language is so ubiquitous, where he says, we two shall be one, a single coin, which on either side 2 figures join, or we shall be a single almond, but 2 kernels will be in that single nut. Right. And there's a whole bunch of this like 2-in-1 language, and it's not quite yet, but it's coming.
And then he weeps, and then from watching her, Majnun grew sick at heart, and in his anguish tore his clothes apart, losing all self-control. He couldn't think, but felt like someone overcome by drink. Regret had purified his soul, but still he felt torn open by his restless will that cut him to the bone, as if a knife would strike into his soul and take his life. And he howls and runs away with his animal friends.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And this crushes Layli, and she dies, and that doesn't immediately crush Majnun, but nevertheless, he spends most of the rest of his days at her graveside, surrounded by animals. It's a rough ending.
It is a rough ending, but it's quite something. And it's, like I said, I find it endlessly interesting how much this, like, how can I put it? How many different versions of this narrative were already out there, when Nezami is writing, but also how much it gave rise to in terms of other literary forms, in terms of visual depictions, beautiful manuscript illustrations of it. Like I said, the schoolroom, Majnun in the desert, like all different kinds of ways of depicting this story. And then, even like we were saying in the 20th century, we mentioned music, we mentioned Eric Clapton, but also, you remember we read Blind Owl earlier this year, back in January, by Sadak Hadayat. And there, obviously it was a very different kind of 20th century novel, but it was relying on you being familiar with stories like this one, like Attar's Conference of the Birds, like Layli and Majnun, to understand what that love story template is that gets so deformed in the mind of the narrator of Blind Owl. So there's like so much that it's so like fecund. I think that's one of the reasons why it's such a neat thing to read. And in this translation, I think it's very readable. Like it's very pleasurable to read too.
Well, there's a lot more to say about Layli and Majnun, but I feel like we should take a little breather. It's summertime. We're a little bit late getting this episode out because of travel and sickness and other issues, life. But thank you everybody for your patience. And I'm just curious, what has been your summer beach reading? or whatever you've been reading. Maybe not at the beach.
Well, I would have been really worried about having an answer for this a couple of weeks ago because it was such a busy summer and so much stuff was going on. I didn't do a lot of other reading, but I picked up this book, which I am absolutely in love with, and I've only read about a third of it. It's The Letters of Rainer Maria Rilke, 1892 to 1910. So this is the first volume of his letters. And I love his poetry. Like, I've read it for many years, and I just love his poetry. And I'd run across some of his prose here and there, but I ran across this lovely volume of letters. And I'm going to, in the spirit of loving lists, I'm just going to read a little passage from it. I have to, because I know you will enjoy it. This is a letter to Clara Westhoff in 1900. He says, "That evening as we sat together in the little blue dining room, we also spoke of other things. In the cottage there would be light, a soft veiled lamp, and I would stand at my stove and prepare a supper for you. A fine vegetable or cereal dish, and heavy honey would gleam on a glass plate, and cold ivory pure butter would form a gentle contrast to the gaiety of a Russian tablecloth. Bread would have to be there, strong, coarse-grained bread and zwieback, and on a long, narrow dish, somewhat pale Westphalian ham, streaked with bands of white fat like an evening sky with long, drawn-out clouds. Tea would stand ready for the drinking, gold-yellow tea in glasses with silver holders, exhaling a delicate fragrance. Great lemons cut in discs would sink like suns into the golden dusk of the tea, dimly shining through it with the radiant flesh of their fruit, and its clear, glassy surface would tremble from the sour, rising juices." It goes on. It's so good. You will recognize immediately why I would love that passage.
Yeah, that's great.
Right? It's a list and it's food. Anyway, so he's a beautiful writer, so I'm really enjoying that. I've been reading it very slowly. What have you been reading?
That's a great question. I also have not been reading much recently, and I realized as I was thinking about this that I had started a book before I went traveling and then before I got sick, and I should get around to finishing it. I started finally reading The Hobbit.
Oh, wow. I didn't know you didn't read it.
Well, I tried reading it when I was a kid and bounced way off it. I just
Yeah, me
did
too.
not-
I could not read it, and then I read Lord of the Rings, and then I could read it.
Yeah, exactly. So having now read Lord of the Rings, I decided I would give The Hobbit another try, and I was enjoying it well enough, although it is kind of, I don't know, some books are not as you expect them to be. This was one of them. For example, I didn't realize how quickly Gollum appears and how quickly he's like, it's just done. It's like, but you're so important in the other books that I've read.
I know, it's not wild. And the tone is totally different.
The tone is very different. And if you thought there were few female parts in Lord of the Rings, wow, The Hobbit has news for you.
Also, do not watch the movies. They're terrible.
No, I've been warned against them. Anyway, I was enjoying The Hobbit well enough to keep going through it, but then I got distracted, and it's been a month, and I think I'll be able to pick it up again with no problem, but I need to actually do that.
Oh, I'll be glad to hear what you think of it. So the one we're reading next time is one you've read before, I think.
No, I've never read this one that
Really?
we're reading next time. No.
Oh my God, you're in for a wild ride.
We're reading Geoffrey Chaucer's Troilus and Cresside, and I have read, I finally broke down towards the end of my grad school and read some of the Canterbury Tales, but I've read almost no Chaucer, kind of to make a point.
Yeah, it's actually super interesting. I think you'll like it. It's like I know this sounds kind of stupid, but it's very novel-like, and I know that sounds stupid and anachronistic, but it really is, like in terms of what's going on with the people. I don't know any medieval text that is as novel-y as Troilus and Cresside.
Well, that's interesting. I know that people quite like it. I'm no longer in medieval studies, as an academic, so I no longer need to be there are places other than England and people other than Chaucer for us to talk about. I no longer need to be quite so adamant about it as I once felt I had to be. So I am looking forward to sitting down and reading this.
And also a bunch of the stuff we've been talking about today, like this whole question of like love, the nature of love, also love sickness and disordered states of mind, like in a lot of different ways. I'm sure those things are going to come up as well.
Now, for listeners who want to read ahead, is this a book that they should try to read in translation, or should they try to tackle Middle English if they're not a specialist?
I would say people who are accustomed to reading earlier Englishes, like say you're accustomed to reading like Shakespeare plays or something, you wouldn't find it too hard, I don't think, to at least look at parts of the Middle English. But it goes a lot faster if you have a modernization.
All right. Duly noted.
And it's long enough that that might be a good idea.
Well, I'm looking forward to that. Until then, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm. We'd love to hear from you. This show is made possible by people like you, supporting us on Patreon. And patrons get to hang out with us in a friendly Discord. So find out more at patreon.com/megaphonic. Show notes with links for anything we've mentioned in this episode are at megaphonic.fm/spouter/70. And the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So until next time.
Until next time, see you again at the Spouter-Inn.